Hey everyone, I want to show you a paper about the evolution of a moth. Now, evolutionists say that this example proves evolution. But not only does it not prove evolution, it demolishes evolution. First, I want to show you some background, and then we'll take a look at the paper. So in 1859, Charles Darwin proposed his theory of evolution, and in that theory, Darwin said the species arose by natural means. All of the species, all of the plants, all of the animals, the entire biological world arose by chance and natural law. How is that supposed to work? So Darwin began with the fact that populations have biological variation. Some individuals are larger, some individuals are faster, and so forth. There is biological variation. Some of that variation is helpful to the individual. Some of that variation is hurtful to the individual. And when I say helpful and hurtful, I'm talking about not just survival of the individual, but also the chances of reproduction. Reproduction is key here. So here we have a population of individuals. The yellow individual has a chance improvement. Now over time, because that helps the individual, he has more children than the others. And over time, that improvement comes to dominate in the population. It takes over in the population. This process of a chance improvement that subsequently becomes dominant in the population is referred to as natural selection. Darwin called that natural selection. It's simply a label for this process of a chance improvement becoming dominant. Now we need to be careful here. Natural selection does not induce the improvement in the first place. These are decoupled. Natural selection is merely the process of the improvement spreading over time via differential reproduction. Natural selection does not cause the improvement. Natural selection and the improvement are decoupled. There's no causal link in evolutionary theory. Two different things. Now fast forward 100 years and you have the discovery of the DNA structure, and you have the discovery of the cellular processes around the DNA structure, all of the complicated machinery. A copy is made of the DNA. It's used to create a protein. Proteins are made with the information stored in the DNA molecule, in the genes in the DNA. In that process, a code is used, and it's called the genetic code, the universal genetic code you see here. So now, instead of referring to improvements, evolutionists use the word mutation. Mutations arise. Sometimes they're helpful, some more often hurtful, but on rare occasions you might have a good mutation, and it will come to dominate in the population via this natural selection process. So now we say a chance mutation propagates over time. With all of these discoveries, evolutionists became very confident. Now evolution had the details, those technical cellular and molecular details that explained exactly how evolution works. They hailed this as a great victory, and now evolution really was known to be a fact. But there's a problem here. I hope a red flag pops up for you here, because there's serendipity in this whole explanation. And what do I mean by that? Well, in this story, evolution must have created evolution. In other words, evolution had to create the DNA itself, the genetic information, the genes in the DNA, the molecular machinery surrounding the DNA code itself, etc., etc. It had to create these things initially in order to have evolution. Evolution creates these things so evolution could happen. We need to be clear here, the DNA was constructed somehow by these random mutations without knowing how it would be used. The genetic information, the genes were created one mutation at a time without knowing what the gene would be at the end. The molecular machinery must have been created one step at a time without knowing how this whole ball of wax would fit together and start creating proteins. All of these things had to be created one step at a time without knowledge, without foreknowledge of what was going to come about. That's serendipity, a lot of serendipity. So there's a red flag for you. But it gets worse now. Now let's talk about this moth. So the story of the peppered moth is that in the early 1800s, there were these moth populations in England. The moths were predominantly light-colored, but you had industrial pollution. The trees darkened, the light-colored moths were more susceptible to predation, and so therefore they were killed off more readily. The few black moths in the population then took over the population. They grew in number, and the white moths died off in number. This is the textbook orthodoxy that I'm telling you. It's the proposed explanation. I'm not going to question that. I'm going to take it at face value for the purposes of this video. This is referred to as industrial melanism. And here's a paper from 2012 that wrapped up this story. There had been some problems. This story fixed up those problems. And the paper concluded industrial melanism in the peppered moth is still one of the clearest and most easily understood examples of Darwinian evolution in action. Here's the Wikipedia page on this peppered moth story. And it also agrees that this is great evidence for evolution. In fact, it uses this same quote from the paper that the peppered moth evolution is the most direct evidence and one of the clearest and most easily understood examples of Darwinian evolution in action. Skipping down, they quote from a famous evolutionist, leading evolutionist, Jerry Coyne, professor at the University of Chicago, who at one point doubted some of this, but then after seeing that paper on the study agreed, yes, this is a great example of evolution. And he also referred to that same quote in the paper. Industrial melanism in the peppered moth is still one of the clearest and most easily understood examples of Darwinian evolution in action. Now, this wasn't exactly new sentiment. This had been textbook orthodoxy and for many years had been claimed to be just fantastic evidence for evolution. Here, Isaac Asimov stated this in one of his books back in the 1980s. The mere color changes in the peppered moth prove evolution, Asimov said. So evolutionists are very confident that this is an example of evolution in action. However, this is all false. So let's start by asking the question, how did the moths turn dark in the first place? So here's a 2016 paper that looked at the genetic details and tried to figure out what is going on in the dark moths that are making them dark. Now, reading from the abstract here, here we show that the mutation event giving rise to the industrial melanism in Britain was the insertion of a large transposable element into the part of this gene called cortex. So you had a transposable element. Transposable elements are sections of DNA that can move around. Sometimes they're called jumping genes, an alliteration that's not quite accurate because they're not merely genes, but the point is there's sections of DNA that can jump around, move in and out in different places in the DNA. Very complicated process. Skipping down here, this transposition event occurred around 1819. And finally, this adds a further layer of insight into the mechanism of adaptation in response to natural selection. Wait a minute. What was that? A mechanism of adaptation in response to natural selection? Now going back, remember we said natural selection and the mutation are decoupled. In evolutionary theory, there is no causal link. Natural selection doesn't cause the mutations to occur. But here it says mechanism of adaptation in response to natural selection. That doesn't make sense. Now let's move down into the introduction here. The significance of characterizing the identity and origin of functional sequence polymorphisms is in providing an explicit link between the mutation process and natural selection. Wait a minute, let's break that down here. Let's look at that sentence more carefully. The significance of characterizing the identity and origin of functional sequence polymorphisms is in providing an explicit link between the mutation process and natural selection. We had to work through quite a bit. That sentence had many layers of abstraction, but we finally got there in the end, a link between the mutation process and natural selection. So once again, they're making this statement, there must be a link. No, there is no link under evolutionary theory. Natural selection and the mutation are decoupled. There is no causal link under evolutionary theory. And yet here it says an explicit link between the mutation process and natural selection. If there's a link between a mutation and natural selection, then mutations are not random, but instead respond to environmental challenges. That implies teleology. That's not evolutionary theory. Darwin explicitly, and later evolutionists up until today, explicitly exclude teleology. Now let's move down in the paper. Here is a diagram of that insertion. So the top part of this diagram shows a segment of DNA in the moth, and you take this middle segment and zoom in, and it shows the insertion here in yellow. So you have the dark moth with that orange insertion. The light moth does not have the insertion. You see a gap here. The gap is shown only because they want to keep the DNA aligned between the white and the dark moth. Of course, in the white moth there is no gap. And then in the bottom portion of the figure, you zoom in on the transposable element. Now skipping down, they make the observation that there's probably very few of these particular transposable elements in the moth genome. And furthermore, they don't find any outside of the species. So this is not a common transposable element. Now skipping down in the paper, they conclude that our results support the idea that cortex is a conserved developmental node for generating color pattern variation in evolutionarily diverse Lepidoptera. Now what is cortex? Cortex is that gene that the transposable element was inserted into. Okay, so they're saying this gene is used for color pattern variation across the Lepidoptera. Now what is that? Lepidoptera is an order that includes butterflies and moths. So they're saying across all of these different species, this gene called cortex influences or controls color pattern variation. And in these moths that we're looking at, it can make them dark or it can make them light. Now I hope a red flag has gone up for you here. Let's again look at this quote. For generating. They're saying that this gene cortex is used for generating color pattern variation. That is the infinitive form. Whenever you see the infinitive form of a verb, a red flag should go up because it is teleological. Let's read it. Our results support the idea that this gene is conserved across all these different species for generating color pattern variation. For generating, that's goal-oriented. That means there's a purpose, there's a reason, there's a design, there's a blueprint. This is teleological language. It does not work in evolutionary theory. This makes no sense in evolutionary theory, and yet evolutionists use this teleological language all the time. So I've pointed out a couple of examples of teleological language in this paper. What about all this language? What's going on here? Now, if you ask evolutionists about this, they'll say, well, that was a mistake, or it was just a convenience, or we were just being lazy. No, they're not actually being lazy. Evolutionists use teleological explanations to avoid the absurd serendipity that they otherwise would have to admit to. In other words, here are the choices. The evolutionists can either say that natural selection causes an adaptive change, that's teleological, or they can say, well, yet again, evolutionists got extremely lucky. It is a choice between teleology and serendipity, two bad choices for evolutionists. What are the problems with these choices? Well, there's no such thing as teleology in evolutionary theory, and for the serendipity choice, it means that evolution is unlikely. And as I've showed you, they have used teleological language in the paper. Sometimes they'll go over to the other side. Now here's an example where it's a little bit more on the serendipity side. At the end of the paper, they conclude this transposable element is a spectacular example of an adaptively advantageous transposon. So this word spectacular kind of, admits a little bit, this is a little bit lucky here. And it is adaptively advantageous. So under evolutionary theory, this transposable element must have somehow arisen, a very complicated problem right there. But when it arose, there would be no knowledge, no foresight that it would be used to control the color of moths. So here again, a big red flag should go up because of the serendipity implied. Evolution must have created evolution. Earlier, we looked at how evolution must have created the DNA structure, the genetic information, the genes in the DNA, the molecular machinery surrounding the DNA code itself, so that evolution could happen. Evolution created evolution. Now we add to this list adaptive transposable elements. Somehow those must have been evolved, not knowing that this one in particular would control the color of moths. Okay, so we've looked at the complexity of evolutionary theory, and we've looked at this serendipity/teleology problem, but it gets worse. Even if we were to go along with the peppered moth story, as it is told, nothing new evolved. A pre-existing dark color phenotype went from the minority to the majority and then back again to the minority. It was pre-existing, nothing new evolved. Now here's a plot from the paper where they illustrate this rise and fall of the dark phenotype here in the late 1800s and then toward the late 1900s. But in this process, nothing new evolved. Even if we take at face value the textbook explanation here, there were no new genes. Evolution didn't create any new genes. Evolution did not create any new metabolic pathways. No new organs evolved. No new limbs evolved. No new wings or body plan changes evolved here. Nothing new evolved. This is not an example of Darwinian evolution, because under Darwinian evolution, you have to have the entire biological world arising out of nothing. Every species, every plant, every animal must have evolved by chance mutations and natural law. So we go back to the Wikipedia entry in Jerry Coyne and this general statement that evolutionists are making, that industrial melanism in the peppered moth is still one of the clearest and most easily understood examples of Darwinian evolution in action. No, it is not. It is not an example of Darwinian evolution in action. There's nothing new created, nothing new evolved. This statement is what? It is false. So to summarize, we've seen too much theory complexity. We've seen this problem of serendipity or teleology, one or the other. Neither one are very good for evolution. Both demolish the theory, and then nothing new evolved anyway, even if we buy this whole story. So what's going on here? What exactly is going on? I mean, you have the smartest people in the world promoting an obviously false claim. Now, when I say the smartest people in the world and an obviously false claim, I'm certainly not exaggerating. These are researchers and professors in literally the top research institutes in the world, and this is an obviously false, frankly absurd claim that is so easily shot down. How can I explain this? How can you explain this? What's going on here? I have no explanation for this, except, well, there is one. Let's go to the book of Isaiah here. I am the Lord who makes all things, who stretches out the heavens all alone, who spreads abroad the earth by myself. And what? Who turns wise men backward and makes their knowledge foolishness.